Good evening and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Sarah Sambar and I'm one of the fellows here. Much of the strength of the US government lies in its separation of powers. Each branch should be able to operate independently and yet cooperatively. There are always questions about the power of the executive branch. Is there too much, too little, the right amount? What is the proper recourse when the president steps out of line? There have been several instances of executive overreach that we see in the current administration, be it Trump's desire to build a wall or the ban. But this is not a phenomenon specific to President Trump. Presidents often use a wide array of justification for increasing their power, and a common one is war. Joining us tonight is John Yoo, a professor of law at UC Berkeley. He is a man who is intimately familiar with the powers of the executive branch in times of war, and is perhaps the most infamous for his role in drafting the legal justification for torture under the Bush administration. Tonight, he will present on war powers in the 21st century, giving his views on an array of topical subjects, including drones, cyber warfare, and coercion. Professor Yoo clerked for Justice Clarence Thomas of the U.S. Supreme Court and Judge Lawrence H. Silberman of the U.S. Court of Appeals of the D.C. Circuit. He served as general counsel of the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee from 1995 to 96 under Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah. And from 2001 to 2003, he served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel at the U.S. Department of Justice. Professor Yoo has most recently authored Point of Attack, Preventive War, International Law, and Global Welfare. And his newest book, Embrace the Machines, Drones, Cyber War, and Coercion, is forthcoming in spring 2017. Professor Yoo's Athenaeum talk is co-sponsored by the Salvatore Center's Lofgren Lecture in Constitutionalism. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording is strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming John Yoo.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to visit CMC, and in particular to honor Charlie Lofgren, who I feel I met in my mind before I ever met him in person. Charlie has probably been the most rigorous scholar in terms of the war powers debate, arguing that before a president can use force abroad, he must receive authorization from Congress. And so when I was a young law student in my first year, longer ago than anyone will want to know, I kept coming across his name over and over again in the work of law professors who are advocating this position. And the reason why is, this is probably a big secret, but law professors fundamentally are lazy. And so none of these people, including myself at the time, wanted to actually do all the research to figure out what did the framers really think about the Declare War Clause versus the Commander-in-Chief Clause and so on. And so if you trace and if you read all these very famous, well-known law professors, as I was doing at the time, all of their work really traced back to Charlie's work. There was this very famous piece in the early 1970s published in the Yale Law Journal about the original understanding of war powers. And I have to say, I don't think any argument that you have heard or will hear about the Declare War Clause or the Congress's rights in wartime will be anything new compared to what Charlie did, was it 40 years ago? Is that right? 45 years ago. And so in some ways, when I first started my academic career writing about the presidency, I found myself arguing with Charlie because I would read his article and I'd say, that can't be right. God, he did it again. That can't be right either. On and on. So actually reading Charlie's work, I decided to write an article myself, and that was the first law review article that I ever wrote. And so in a weird way, the fact that I'm here and the fact that I did so many things in government is all Charlie's fault. But I could not think of a better honor to actually get to come to speak in front of Charlie and maybe explain some of the reasons why we disagree. But I think we both agree it's a really close question. One thing that Charlie's scholarship, I totally encourage you to look at it, is it's so subtle and really unlike the way lawyers argue, where we argue, well, I'm 100% right, and that other person, the defendant, is 100% wrong. Charlie really approached each piece of evidence in a very judicious tone and admitted where he thought some things were weak and some things were strong. And I hope I've been able to do the same. But I think we would both agree, so whether the president can use force abroad in current conditions on his own or requires the permission of Congress first is a very close and difficult question. So I just wanted to make clear before I started that just make clear my intellectual debt to Charlie. Second, I really want to thank CMC and the Salvatore Center and Athenaeum for inviting me, at least so I could leave the jurisdiction, the People's Republic of Berkeley, and come to slightly more conservative places like Los Angeles. And I'm also, I have to say, very fortunate that I was lucky to be speaking after Heather McDonald and not before Heather McDonald. Often when I speak on panels these days where we talk, the subject that we all talk about is Trump and the presidency, I'm usually paired with someone who's really rabidly pro-Trump. And so usually that person gets hissed, not me anymore. So I really love bringing people like that with me. In the same way, I'm so happy Heather was here to attract all the protesters like moths to the flame, and hopefully so far they've ignored me. But I'd also like to say, just as a side, I was very disturbed to see what happened here last week, and I want to do something about it. So I want to offer a proposal to the CMC administration and faculty that we at Berkeley and you at CMC hold a joint conference next year on free speech and academic freedom on campuses. And I'm willing to commit that at Berkeley anyway, we would jointly fund and provide speakers for such a conference. Because whether you agree with someone like Heather or not, or people on the other side, I think we really are living in a time where we have to reaffirm the principle that we should all be able to speak and think as we wish, especially on college campuses. So I hope that we can figure out a way to cooperate. I would love to bring a conference of some kind here and have a parallel conference up at Berkeley on this important subject. I think it's and I'm so far heartened to see that at least I'm able to speak, but I don't mind being shouted down by protesters too. That's happened from time to time. Berkeley, we have a protest every week. I often say it wouldn't be spring in Berkeley without protests and a little tear gas in the air. So let me just talk a little bit about the subject. So I'm going to try to speak. I understand people usually speak for 45 minutes. I'd like to speak for less. I'm sure you would like me to speak for less. I'm going to try to speak more about for 30 minutes and then reserve the balance of time for questions. I'm going to talk about this question about initiating war. I'm sure people have lots of questions about other things. I'm happy to take questions on anything during the question and answer period. But I'd like to just talk a little bit about the presidency and the right to start war. So first, let me start off by saying some of this stems from a book I wrote a few years ago that tried to figure out why some presidents succeed and some fail. And so to do that, I looked at this poll that is done of political science and historians and some law professors every 4 years that asks us to rank the presidents in order from best to worst. So first, before I did that, I looked up to also try to find out what the popular opinion of successful presidents were. And so this very important journal of scholarly opinion I think it's called Parade Magazine, issued a poll during President Obama's first term, ranking the great presidents. So who do you think that regular Americans interviewed by Parade Magazine identified as the greatest president in American history? Who do you think it would be? Lincoln. You guys are all students of Jaffa and his descendants. That's so far off. Nobody in Parade Magazine's ever read Jaffa. So Lincoln is one of the top 3 presidents in the poll of scholars. Not even, the poll of scholars has 3 presidents who are by far the greatest, and then other ones. So it's not Lincoln. Man, who do you think the regular person interviewed in Parade Magazine would say is the greatest president? Not Reagan? No, not even close. Come on. No. Washington. Okay, so Washington, Lincoln, and FDR are the three greatest presidents in the the poll of political scientists and historians. And it's almost, and political science, faculty, they don't agree about anything, but they almost agree 100% on this, that those are our three. In fact, even if you, correcting, it doesn't matter, political affiliation, what field you're in, actually most scholars agree on the top 10 list of greatest presidents. But Washington, Lincoln, FDR don't make Parade's list. Who do you think it might be? Think about Obama was on the list, but he wasn't number one. He was number 3. And that was after he'd been in office for 4 years. So, yeah, Kennedy. Who's the ringer? Ah, you're the ringer. So, yeah, why do you think it would be Kennedy? Because Kennedy is the first television president. Right? He's handsome, glamorous, handsome family, vision of action, right? After 8 years of sleepy old Eisenhower, right? But Kennedy, where do you think he ranks on the scholars poll of presidents? Do you think he makes the top 10, top 20? He's exactly in the middle. And actually, he's been dropping fast. The more we learn about Kennedy, the worse he's been doing in the polls. Part of this is methodology. When they first did this poll back in the late 1960s, it was done by a Harvard professor named Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And so he thought a scientific way to conduct a poll of great presidents was to call 5 other Harvard professors and ask them. And he published it in the New York Times Sunday magazine, so it had to be true. That's why Charles Kessler is in charge of everything going on in Washington, because that was in the New York Times also, so it must be true. But since then, we've done these much more scientific polls, and all these other professors have weighed in. And so the greatest ones are Washington, Lincoln, FDR. They might argue about which order, but they're all up there. Some of you said Truman. Someone said Truman. Truman is up in the top 10 because he was the one who basically created the policy of containment, right? That led us ultimately to victory over the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Somebody who said Reagan, right? So Reagan was the most controversial one. When he left office, those scholars put him in the bottom 25% of presidents. And now I actually found this hard to believe, but he's ranked 6th, the 6th greatest president in American history. Scholars really hated Reagan with a passion. But now actually, with the distance of time, there are actually several liberal biographers of Reagan who've looked on very favorably. But I think Reagan gets credit for rejuvenating the economy in the 80s and for ending the Cold War. So he gets more credit now than he did then. Any other? That's not even, maybe that's about 5 or 6. Who do you think fills out the rest of the top 10 list? They all are kind of similar in temperament, which is, yep, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is up there. Jefferson is up there, yes. So, I'm sorry? Andrew Jackson is number 9, right? Andrew Jackson's. Hey, they kept him on the $20 bill. He can't be all bad. No, actually, Jackson probably today is probably the more controversial president, I would say, even than Reagan, because of his record with both slavery and treatment of Native Americans. But he also was the maker of our modern democratic process. He was the one who democratized politics. He also was, I think, maybe the precursor of the theory that Lincoln pursued in the Civil War about the primacy of national law versus secession. Jackson was a general, and he had a habit of invading other countries without permission from anyone. But I think one of the most remarkable things was during his presidency, South Carolina threatened to block the enforcement of federal tariff law. And Jackson said if they did not, he was going to raise an army, personally lead it to Charleston, and hang the governor from the nearest tree he could find. And the rebellion ended like that, strangely. But Jackson had these obvious defects, but I think a lot of scholars also recognize this kind of nationalizing and democratizing reputation. But he may fall out of the list. Let's see, no one said Eisenhower, I don't think, who's the opposite of Kennedy in many ways. And this is really a good example of how the reputation of presidents changed, because Eisenhower was thought to be a kind of grandfatherly, genial dodo when he was president. Liked to play golf, didn't seem to be doing anything. All these other people like Nixon and Dulles were running the government. But when the archives were opened, it turned out that Eisenhower was in charge and directly managing all the major policies of his administration. And he had an aide who followed him. I would not recommend this for any of you, but he had a guy who followed him around to every meeting and wrote down exactly everything Eisenhower and everyone else in every meeting he was ever in said. And so we have a really amazing record of what happened behind the scenes. And when that information came out, Eisenhower's reputation skyrocketed. And people now appreciate him much more than they used to. So there's one more who no one mentioned, but if it weren't for him, we probably wouldn't be sitting here today enjoying our nice dinners in the Athenaeum in California. Yeah, Polk. I see. She's like, Charlie, you should not answer because you know too much. James Polk, right, who was famously so mediocre that his campaign platform was, "I promise not to run for second term." Right? I'd be the first one to say, I wish more candidates these days would take such a pledge. What did he do, though, once he became president? He manufactured a crisis with Mexico. We conducted an amphibious invasion of Mexico, captured the capital, deposed the people in charge, and took the best 1/3 of the territory of the country. Right? And because of that, Polk is now considered top 10 president. Before I talk about what they have in common, if it's not obvious what I think they have in common, what I also tried to write about was, what about bad presidents? We actually don't write a lot about bad presidents or think about them and why they turned out so poorly. So who do you think, this is unanimous among scholars, is the worst president in American history? And I will tell you right now, no president of the last 25 years is the worst president in American history, according to scholars. Coolidge, no. Adams. Buchanan. So, yeah, if Pat Buchanan had won, he would be the worst president in American history. I agree with you. But it's actually James Buchanan, who was the president right before Abraham Lincoln. So down there are people like Buchanan, Millard Fillmore, poor guy. That's the bottom 5 list is made up of these people you probably don't even remember heard of. And that's the moral of my story, if there's a moral. It's probably not, moral is not the right word, but the lesson of my argument is, why are Buchanan and Lincoln, the best and the worst, the same circumstances? Right? It's amazing. I think it has a lot to do with presidential power. Buchanan is the president when secession started. Right? When we used to have a longer period between election and inauguration. And in that period, secession starts before Lincoln even takes office. What does Buchanan do? Buchanan is one of the most qualified people to ever be president. He's been Secretary of State, Governor of Pennsylvania, distinguished lawyer. He personally reads the Constitution, and he writes a legal opinion, which is published in the newspapers, saying, I agree, I think secession is unconstitutional. He actually agreed with Lincoln that secession was unconstitutional. And then he said, but I do not see in the Constitution where the president is allowed to use force against a state to stop it from seceding. And for that reason, we judge him the worst president in American history. In fact, then he said, this is even better. He then said, I call on Congress to solve the problem. And so any of you, actually most of you have not, I've worked in Congress. What's the first thing a senator is going to do when he hears of a terrible national problem? And it's their responsibility. They formed a special committee to study the problem. And I'm sure it is still meeting in the basement of the Senate office building to this day. It was called the Crittenden, right? People who know the story, there was actually a committee formed to figure out what to do about the Civil War. Lincoln comes into office. What does he do, right? You're at one of the great centers of the study of the Civil War and Lincoln in the country. Lincoln comes in. I agree secession is unconstitutional. Buchanan and he have the same view. But he says the presidency has the power to expand to meet the exigency of those circumstances. And I think that's the main lesson and the main purpose of the presidency, is that it was the branch of power of the government that was always in being, always present, that could act when other branches could not, to respond to exigencies, to emergencies, to crises, and the highest form of that would be war. And that the legislature, while it is more deliberative and more representative in a way, the legislature, unfortunately, is slow to act, sometimes paralyzed in acting. And I think what the framers took as the lesson of executive power was that the president, some place in government, which we're going to call the president, must have this ability. And sometimes the presidents are going to go too far. Sometimes they're not going to do enough. And so Congress has powers to counterbalance the president if it chooses to use them. But I don't think the framers expected there to be clear, bright line rules that would specifically decide the order that decisions had to be made in when it came to national security and emergencies. So let me before I talk about Charlie's work. On the flip side, I think when it comes to domestic affairs, the framers reversed the polarity of this system. When it comes to domestic issues, they expected Congress to be the primary and initial decision maker and policy maker, and that the executive's job was to be secondary, was to carry out and execute those decisions. But the reason you could have that choice, I think, is that with foreign affairs and national security, if the country does nothing, no one is going to save us. In domestic affairs, if the federal government doesn't act, there are always the states to regulate. There's always a catch-all or reserve of regulation always going on. That means that inaction domestically doesn't harm the country as much as inaction in foreign affairs and national security. So how does this bear out with the war powers question that Charlie and I have worked on for 40 years. I'm just 20 years. And I might just stop now. I'm so tired of it and move to something else, so it's not 40 years too. Charlie's view is that if you look at the sources of history, Congress, the framers expected that to initiate hostilities, Congress would give the authorization first, except in cases of an attack when we were defending ourselves. And his argument is that declare war, the clause, declare war clause, which is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, essentially encapsulates that, not because declare war had the specific meaning under international law of telling the other side you're at war, but because it was understood more broadly to mean start war. Once the war is triggered, then the president's the commander-in-chief, and he becomes the person in charge of tactics, strategy, and so on, and then Congress's role maybe recedes. So Charlie got into a big dust-up a few years ago with the former dean of Yale Law School, a fellow named Eugene Rostow, who worked in the Johnson administration on the Vietnam War. And so Rostow, I got to make sure I have the quote right, I just love it, accused Charlie of being an ultra-Whig, right? I don't even know what that is, but I think Charlie's hair is just fine. I don't know why he would call you an ultra-Whig. It's so strange. And Charlie said something along the lines of, and I think Rostow also, he went way too far. He then accused Charlie of somehow being in favor of a weak United States that would be taken advantage of in the world and couldn't defend itself in its interests. And Charlie said something like, because I don't think I have the exact quote in front of me, he said something along the lines of, my colleagues at Claremont, McKenna, who have known me to be supportive of the Vietnam War and of Reagan, would be most surprised to learn that this is my secret view. And I think that was great because I think Charlie had the better of him, and I think Rostow actually hurt himself by inferring Charlie or anybody had certain policy views based on what he thought about the constitutional text. So I'm going to give you just now 3 pieces of evidence which lead me not to agree with Charlie. And you should decide what you think, who has the better of the argument. So the first thing would be the constitutional history before the framing. So no one disputes that the phrase declare war, the phrase commander-in-chief, come from the British Constitution. And the British Constitution is not a written out, ratified document. It's a series of practices and traditions. At the time of the 18th century, though, these were phrases that were used by well-known lawyers, politicians, judges, commentators to describe the allocation of powers in England. In England, the British king had the power both to declare war and to be commander-in-chief. And so what I thought I would do as a young scholar, having read Charlie's work, was to look up how many times did Great Britain declare war? And particularly, how many times did it declare war before it started fighting? Because it seemed to me if declare war had this meaning, declaring war means we authorize you to start war, you would expect in Great Britain you would have the declarations first and then wars second. And I found in the 100 years before the Constitution, and Great Britain was at war all the time. They hated everybody. They were constant. They even had 3 wars with the Dutch. I mean, who has had wars with the Dutch? They're so harmless and inoffensive. But they went to war 3 times with the Dutch in the 17th century. In the 100 years before the Constitution, in all those many, many wars, at least 12, there were probably more, the British declared war once before hostilities started. I think that means, to me, the declaration of war was not really synonymous with begin or authorize. In fact, I think a great thing to look at as a paradigm of a declaration of war is our Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is, if you look at it and look at declarations of war, it's very similar. The Declaration is essentially a declaration of war. The interesting thing is, right, we issued the Declaration of War long after fighting broke out in the colonies between the Crown and our revolutionary leaders. So I don't think it was atypical or unusual that declarations of war would be issued. They're very formalistic. They're like the start of a lawsuit. They have a set of complaints and facts, and then what you have to do to remedy the situation. They weren't the same, at least to me, as does the president or Congress get to start, something the United States as a whole issues to another country to notify it of the law. Charlie's view is that the Constitution's text is not made up of these specific, narrow legal meanings, but that it had a broader understanding that wasn't just legal, but more declare war just meant start. The second piece of evidence that caused me to disagree would be the constitutional text. So let me see if I've got one. Let's see, chocolate bar, headphones. Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution's in there too. So this is a provision that I think Charlie and I are the only people who ever have written about this and care about it so. So this is a provision that restricts the states from waging war. Right? So it's not about the president versus Congress. But it's really interesting to look at the language that the framers chose when they said states shall not wage war. It says, no state shall, without the consent of Congress, engage in war. It doesn't say shall not declare war. It says shall not engage in war. And even has the thing about Congress's giving you permission first, right? It says without the consent of Congress, engage in war. And then, this is the best part, it even has an exception for attacks. So it says, unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. So John Marshall long ago said we should try to read the Constitution as a complete and whole text and give all the words of the Constitution meaning. And when there are differences in words, we should give them differences of meaning. So the thing I don't understand is when the framers wanted to say you couldn't wage war without Congress's permission, except when you're attacked, they knew exactly how to say it. They said it so specifically in Article 1, Section 10. So when it came time to limiting the president, why didn't Congress say the president shall not, without the consent of Congress, engage the nation in war unless actually invaded? Why didn't they just switch state for president or president for state, one or the other? Right? It would have been exactly what people today, I would say most scholars influenced by Charlie's work, think the declare war clause means. It even has an exception that most people say is not in the text, they admit it, but has to be read and understood. So I've always wondered, why do we assume such strange draftsmanship on the part of the framers, where they would talk about the president and the Congress, declare war, commander-in-chief, but when it came time to the nation versus states, they were very precise in achieving this goal. So that's the second thing that actually probably is the argument that caused me to think differently than Charlie. And then the third thing I would say, and this is much harder to convey, is just one's impression after reading the ratification debates and the process of adopting the Constitution. And so in that last area, and then I'm going to stop talking about the differences between Charlie and I may talk about some things we have in common, is the argument between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And I hope all of you, or at least the ones who are studying government or political science, you've read the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, and you've looked at the ratification debates probably ad nauseum. In those debates, the Anti-Federalists often attacked the Constitution for creating a presidency that was too powerful, that would use war to aggrandize its own powers. Patrick Henry in the Virginia Ratifying Convention said, he's the fellow who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," right? After people met him, they usually wanted to give him the latter, not the former. That just as a side note, that reminds me of a good joke I heard about Ted Cruz that was made by Senator Mitch McConnell. So Senator McConnell said, a little old lady came up to him and said, "Why do people take such an instant dislike to Ted Cruz?" And so he said to the little lady, "Because it saves time." So use that for whoever you like. It's a great joke. You can just substitute whoever you don't like for Ted Cruz. Anyway, Patrick Henry attacks the Constitution repeatedly in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. I would say the most important ratifying convention of all the states. If Virginia hadn't ratified the Constitution, it's very hard to imagine the country going forward. There would have been no place to get our presidents from in the beginning of the history of the country. And it was a crucial state right in the middle of the country. The Constitution only passes in Virginia by 88 to 80 votes, 4-vote difference, right? And in that convention, Patrick Henry goes on and on about the military adventurism possible with this. In fact, he says, "You've created a king, an American king, not a Republican leader." James Madison, who I think has a different view just a few years later when he's attacking the Washington administration. But James Madison and his allies get up and say, the situation here is different because here the executive controls the sword, but the legislature controls the purse. It wouldn't be like in England where a king was allowed to raise an army by himself. An American president couldn't go on military ventures because Congress had the power of funding. And I think that's the real check that the framers thought. Would apply to the war power. I don't think that the war power is completely unlimited for the president. I think the check is just different. It's not Congress passes a law first. Congress uses its funding power to restrict the presidency. If you go back and think about what our country was like before 1945, this was a complete and perfect check because the United States did not have a significant standing army until after 1945. If you were a president and you wanted to wage war against Mexico or Spain in 1898 or even World War I, you had to go to Congress and ask it to build you an army and a navy. And without that, you could not pursue offensive military operations. And so I would say, to the extent people today are disturbed, worried, think that presidents have gone too far, I would say the presidents have not really been doing it by themselves. I think throughout they have been aided by Congress, and that Congress agrees with the much more assertive approach in the world that the United States has assumed since 1945. It's only Congress that could authorize and pay for the largest military in the world, a military larger, I think, than the 10 following countries after us. And during the 2000s, it was larger than all the arms spending in the rest of the world combined. And it is an army and a navy and an air force that are not designed for homeland defense. I think one of the unfortunate things I learned about on 9/11 when I was in the government was that there are actually almost no military units in the United States that are designated for homeland defense, which is why terrorists could hijack planes and without any threat of air intercept, drive them into New York City and Washington, D.C., because there were no real armed Air Force units, fighter jets stationed to protect our cities back then. Our military, if you look at it, is designed for offensive operations. It is what is called an expeditionary military. It's designed to fight wars in other people's countries so that the war never comes here. Carrier battle groups, which cost billions of dollars, are almost useless for homeland defense. What they are is stationing, right, an air base right offshore other people's countries and using it to attack them. They provide almost no value when it comes to defending the continental United States. If Congress does not want the president to have the ability to wage offensive war or go on adventures or whatever you want to call it, what critics call it or supporters call it, they can pay for and design a very different military. But it has chosen not to do so since 1945, because I believe there has been much more of a consensus about foreign policy and war between the two branches than people think. So the one thing, and I'll start to close, the one thing I think maybe Charlie and I agree on is that the Constitution is not a substitute for politics. I would say Congress does have a lot of authority to restrict and control the president if it wants to, but they don't want to. I mean, I've worked in Congress and I've worked in the executive branch. I think members of Congress are very happy to let presidents take the responsibility for making these kinds of life and death decisions and to be accountable for them. And members of Congress would be very happy if no one was angry at them about whether we went to war or not. They're very happy not to assert their constitutional powers. But because they make a political decision not to, shouldn't be read to be some kind of fundamental defect in the constitutional order, one that would cause us today to rearrange all the institutions to come into some kind of notion of balance that we might have today between the president and Congress, which we can't measure and can't be sure is the right one. So instead, I would say if you're angry about President Trump attacking Syria on Friday or President Obama attacking Libya a few years ago, neither of which were authorized by Congress, I think the main beef is with Congress, not the president, because I think Congress is equally in agreement to allow the president to do that and choosing not to do what it can do to stop it. So I'd like to close now and take your questions and comments. I've tried to leave about 40 minutes, I guess, for questions. I take it we're going to run to 8 o'clock. But when I close, let me just also say one last thing about Trump, because I think my introducer sort of wanted to talk about Trump, because she did during the whole dinner. Which is fine. I love talking about Trump. He's so endlessly fascinating and interesting, as billionaires are. No, so I think that what I would say about Trump is that, and I think this also started under Obama and under Bush, is that a lot of these powers I've talked about that reside in the presidency and are for emergencies and crises, the thing that I think is fundamentally happening to our constitutional order is that presidents over many years, maybe started with FDR, who, remember, he said the economy and the Great Depression is the enemy. And he used a lot of wartime imagery and rhetoric and wartime mobilization approaches to handling the Great Depression. Presidents over time have been using the powers of the president designed for foreign affairs and national security for domestic problems, and that we have seen a great expansion of presidential power at home. And then I think a lot of that is causing people to be worried and to be uncertain. You see it, I think, in the various executive orders on immigration that President Trump has issued. I also think, however, that over the last presidency and probably this one, we're going to see presidents who actually are, or at least say they are, interested in retracting presidential power abroad, in reducing the United States' role and reducing the president's role in foreign policy. Remember, President Obama decided not to use force in Syria because Congress would not authorize it. That, to me, actually represents a distortion of the presidency as originally designed, where the presidency becomes the narrower secondary branch when it comes to foreign policy and tries to be the initiator and the leading branch when it comes to domestic policy. So I hope that I have very little hope that this will happen, but my hope is someday that polarity will be reversed and that Congress will come again to be the primary policymaker domestically and the president will be secondary, and vice versa when it comes to national security. So thank you very much for bearing with me, and I look forward to your questions.
We will now have time for question and answer. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and Michael or I will come to you. Priority will be given to students.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So I'm curious where you think the War Powers Resolution falls into this whole debate as to what kind of war powers the president versus Congress has, because that seems to complicate things quite a lot.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and you're right to point out that I skipped over or ignored the War Powers Resolution, because I hate to talk about unconstitutional things, or at least in my view. So this is how I would approach it. I don't think Charlie would disagree with this. The president and Congress have a certain allocation of war power. The War Powers Resolution can't change it, one way or the other. So if you already think Congress has the authority to declare, to start hostilities by the declare war power, the War Powers Resolution is just the implementation of that power, but it doesn't change the constitutional balance. And if you're like me and you think the president has this power to start hostilities, then the War Powers Resolution can't take it away either. Now, the weird thing, and this is what I think you're right about, it complicates things, is the War Powers Resolution is a strange compromise because it doesn't prohibit the president from using force, but it says the president should come to Congress for some kind of authorization after 60 days. At the same time, presidents for a long time had a habit of ending their wars within 60 days. But they also said, I'm not going to admit that it was the War Powers Resolution that made me. On the other hand, Congress would not enforce the War Powers Resolution by attaching it to spending. It's been very easy for Congress to say, and at the end of the 60 days, all funding for military operations abroad cease. Congress never did that either. And so to me, I actually think the War Powers Resolution has become something of a dead letter. Neither branch believes in it, neither branch enforces it or obeys it. I'll tell you a personal story. So I was in the Justice Department at 9/11 and during the beginning of the Iraq War. And despite my constitutional views, I thought politically it was a very good idea to get agreement from Congress on both conflicts beforehand. Because I thought, based on what I was arguing to, I think Congress loves for presidents to go ahead and say, if it's a bad war, it's their fault. If it was a good war, well, we were with you the whole time. And so the thing that was really odd to me was that both resolutions, the 9/11 resolution, which was passed 1 week later, and the what's called the AUMF, the Authorization to Use Military Force for Iraq as well as 9/11, when it came time to drafting them and passing them, the members of Congress called us in the executive branch to draft it for them. That's not the most confident move if you believe in the war powers of your own branch, is to ask the executive branch to draft them. And so I read every declaration of war and authorization we had because Charlie's work forced me to. I will never forgive him for that. So I've read, the dozens and dozens of all. So I drafted one up for Iraq, and I remember going over to, brief a senator about the authorization. And he says, what's this word mean? What's that word mean? It's like, well, this is why. And I remember him distinctly said, why are you making us vote on this? I don't want to vote on this. And I said, Senator, I used to work in the Senate. You don't have to do anything you don't want to, but the last thing you should do is ask an executive branch lawyer to come over and draft the law for you and then tell you you have to vote for it. That, to me, was a sign that the members of Congress are not interested in standing up for the War Powers Resolution or any other way, to contain the initiative on the executive. I'm never going to say who the senator was, unless someone paid me a lot of money.
Hi, thanks for your chat. It was great. I have a quick question about the difference between Congress being superior domestically and the executive being superior in the international realm. Because it seems clear, or might be clear, that extraordinary actions or hostilities abroad can warrant extraordinary actions domestically. And I'm wondering if you look at a case like, let's say, Youngstown Sheet, whether the court got it wrong, and especially in Jackson's concurrence, whether he misinterpreted the Constitution.
So first, I'm going to blame Kessler and Rossum and Ullman, all those guys sitting there planting all these ringer questions throughout the audience, because no one in any college I've ever spoken for ever asked me specifically about a Supreme Court case and named it Youngstown Sheet and Tube. So kudos to you and your teachers. Very good. I can't remember what I was going to say. I'm still struck by the fact that a college student asked me about Youngstown. So one thing about Youngstown that's interesting, if you remember, for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading Youngstown many, many times and trying to figure out what it meant, this is the case where Harry Truman seized the steel mills during the Korean War. Congress did not give him authority to. Truman said, we're at war. The steel needs to be used for munitions. If we don't get it going over to the theater, the war effort will collapse. Our troops in the field will be harmed. Congress had considered giving the president the power and decided not to, voted down an amendment to what's called the Taft-Hartley Act, I believe, to give the president this power to seize the steel mills. Before this, presidents had done things like this. President Roosevelt, in the years before and during World War II, had seized munitions factories, airplane factories on this ground. Jackson happened to be the Attorney General at the time that FDR did this. This was not lost on the people who lost the case and pointed it out to Jackson, who then struck down Truman's seizure of the steel mills. And so Jackson set up this three-part analysis. And any students of the government department, please rise up and correct me if I get it wrong. So category one, if Congress authorizes the president to do something, the president wins. Category three, the bottom category, if Congress has prohibited the president from doing something, the president loses, except, and this is the murky language, except in areas where the Constitution gives the power to the president already. And then there's this middle area, which Jackson called the Twilight Zone. And this was before the TV show, so I think he's owed royalties by the television show Twilight Zone for coming up with this, where Congress doesn't say anything and the president acts, which is a lot of the cases I'm describing, I think, fall into that. Like Lincoln, for example, at the beginning of the Civil War. Congress does nothing, Congress not even meeting at the time, and Lincoln acts. Right? He calls up the army, volunteers, he sets up a blockade, he starts offensive operations against the South. Jackson said, I don't know what happens in this middle zone. Sometimes the president wins, sometimes the president loses. It's very difficult, but he says we shouldn't read congressional acquiescence out of silence. I think that's a fine model for domestic affairs. And the majority opinion that people don't generally read anymore, which is Justice Black's opinion, made the point that Youngstown should not be read to govern what happens abroad on the battlefield. So that the Youngstown Framework is, I think, consistent with this idea. In domestic policy, the Congress has all the authorities and is the primary decision maker, and the president's main constitutional authority domestically is taking care that the laws are faithfully executed, which is more a restriction than a power in some way. But I think it's more difficult to claim, at least on the terms of Youngstown, that that framework applies to foreign affairs. So for example, if you believe the Youngstown applied that way, then could Congress say during World War II, you can't use nuclear weapons ever? Or you have to invade Japan first, not Europe. Right? These are actually, right, that latter view was actually a view many people in Congress had at the time. Because of Pearl Harbor, they wanted to go to Asia first, not Europe. Could Congress actually pass laws that told the president that he could or couldn't do things which he thought were tactically or strategically necessary on the battlefield to prevail in war? So I would say Youngstown can't be read to go that far, but it makes a lot of sense when it comes time to domestic affairs. Let me also just say, I think this is also what we're getting about is a question of civil liberties. When it comes to civil liberties domestically, a lot of times the things that people are most upset about are moments when the president and Congress agreed and cooperated. I mean, the worst example is Korematsu, right? The detention of Japanese Americans just because of their race during World War II because they were suspected to be disloyal. Not only did FDR do this, it's actually odd. There was a great split within the executive branch about the utility of the order, and there was a young man named J. Edgar Hoover who actually stood up for the Japanese Americans. This was probably the last time that this was going to happen with Hoover. But Congress also authorized it. I think a lot of people forget that this was an area where the president and Congress agreed. The other one I'll talk about is electronic surveillance, which has also got a lot of people upset. This is an area, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act gives the president a lot of authority to conduct surveillance in the name of national security. And when the presidents have gone farther because of emergency, Congress years later approved it and passed statutes specifically at the request of both the Bush and Obama administrations to enhance executive authority and surveillance. So the other thing I just would say is don't be so sure that requiring congressional agreement is going to stop policies that you don't like. Sorry for the long-winded question. No, you should be sorry for the long-winded question. I'm sorry for the long-winded answer. Sorry.
Hi, thank you again for your talk. When you spoke about the declaration of war and the question surrounding does it begin war or not, it's interesting that you pointed back to trying to find the intention behind that. And so to kind of segue into a different sort of topic, I was wondering how that plays into authorizing the enhanced interrogation techniques, because it seems to me that those seem to not apply like the intention behind not having torture. It seems to go around that, but that's interesting that for the declaration of war, you go right to the intention for that piece. I was wondering what your opinion was.
Yeah, so let me try to be clear about this. So actually one of the people at the table asked me if he said, sir, are you an originalist? I said, don't tell anybody, but I think I am an originalist. So when it comes time to constitutional interpretation, I do think that the lodestar should be, what did the people who ratified the Constitution think it meant? And that's where Charlie and I have this dream, is what did the ratifiers think declare war meant? But we both, I think, would agree that is the main enterprise. And we shouldn't interpret it based on what we think today declare war means. Okay. So I am an originalist. That's not to say that the Constitution can't give vague powers. So I would say the grant of the executive power to the president in the Constitution has a more open-ended understanding to it, just like the way the use of the phrase due process in the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment also is somewhat open-ended. It's not clearly defined. When it comes time to reading a congressional statute, like the Anti-Torture Act, I'll tell you what happened. So maybe 3 months after the 9/11 attacks, our intelligence agencies capture the number 3, 4, and 5 members of Al-Qaeda. It's as if Al-Qaeda had captured Rumsfeld, Tenet, and Rice, which some people may wish had happened. But it's an enormous intelligence coup. These are also people who are trained to resist interrogation of the standard kind. And so the CIA comes and they say, look, we think they have intelligence about pending attacks on the United States. Al-Qaeda has a history of going back to the same places and trying to attack them over and over again. At this time, we know, this is not classified anymore. At this time, we know very little about Al-Qaeda. And so the CIA says, we want to use these, say, 15 interrogation methods. Can we use them? The statute that governs them is the anti-torture statute. If you were to read the statute, it does not have a list of things you are allowed to do or not to do. The statute says the government cannot intentionally inflict severe, long-term mental or physical pain or suffering. That's what the statute says. There's no committee reports, there's no fancy speeches, there's no hearings which describe, there's no judicial decisions, there's no executive branch decisions about what this statute means. And so I would say, under the pressure of wartime, we had to figure out a line. I don't think it's a lawyer's job to say, and I think this is maybe different about the way we teach things in law school than maybe in college, or maybe they're not that different. I don't think it's the lawyer's job for me to say, I don't like any of this. I don't think you should do it. I think it's immoral. I don't think it's going to work. I think the lawyer's job is to say, what does that law mean? And to the best of my ability, can I draw it somewhere? And look, well, maybe I am stupid, but I don't think I'm stupid. I knew this was going to be extremely controversial and that half the country would hate what we did and half the country might like what we did, but it was going to be probably the most controversial decision you could make in the government. And we drew the line where we drew the line. And people disagree, some people agree, but I don't think that one could say no interrogation methods at all. If you have that view, if you think it's immoral or you think it's not going to work, you can always, I think this is the ultimate, you have to resign from office and not carry out your job because you can't. What I worry about are people who, and this is not just about this question, a lot of questions, I think there are a lot of people who think the law is going to supply difficult moral answers to us. I don't think it does. I think what the law does is the Constitution being the basic one, but laws, since they describe a boundary, like on a playing field. The law does not tell you which plays to call and run on the field. You decide that. That's why we have elections. So to me, I think the harder decision is the one that President Bush had to make and the members of the National Security Council who had to decide this question, which is, this is what the law may allow, but what should we actually do within the bounds of the law?
Thank you for the talk. One interesting thing that came out of the New York Times editorial board recently was about how Congress should pass an AUMF to fight ISIS. My question deals with the nexus between passing an AUMF and dealing with domestic policy. So how would passing an AUMF affect Trump's travel ban? And is there like a justification if an AUMF is passed against ISIS?
So let me first say, I don't find the New York Times editorial page to be the most consistent speaker on constitutional issues, particularly when it has come to Syria and the Civil War. I hate to say it, but I think that they read the law differently when they like the president in charge and they dislike the president in charge. And I don't like the president in charge now. And let me say, I also tried to the best I could defend President Obama on many of his national security decisions. But I don't find the Times has been that consistent. I don't find they were calling for a new AUMF for the last 8 years. Right? All of a sudden, they've decided we need one. Well, it's like gambling's going on here. I'm shocked. So, should there be a new AUMF? So, you could make the argument, as the governments have under Obama, and I assume under Trump, we don't have a legal opinion from the Trump administration. Are the enemies we're fighting in Syria still connected enough to the original people who carried out the 9/11 attacks or aided and harbored them to still constitute falling within the AUMF? I think Trump has a hard time with that, with the bombing on Friday, because we attacked the Syrian government. We're not attacking, and I don't think people are making the claim in DC that the Syrian government was connected to the 9/11 attacks. So if you take the Lofgren view, I think you would have to say the bombing in Syria was unconstitutional, because it does fall outside that original authorization we got back in September 18th of 2001. It's a closer question whether ISIS, which some people say is an offshoot from Al-Qaeda, even though they're fighting each other now, and the associated groups are all fighting the civil war in Syria, still fall within that authorization. The extent they're fighting in Iraq, there's still an authorization to use force from 2003, and the Obama administration relied on that to continue military operations up until just last year. So I think that's a hard question. Personally, I'm not sure what would happen if you submitted it to Congress. I bet what Congress will do is nothing. And then you're left back in the Twilight Zone with Justice Jackson and not knowing what to do. Maybe it's better just to leave things the way they are and operate under the authorities that Congress has already given. And if they disagree, they can start by not replenishing the 59 Tomahawk missiles that were launched And they can start by putting more funding riders in this big budget bill that's about to go through to restrict the president. The second part of your question was about the interaction between AUMF and Trump's executive order on immigration. So I've been a big critic of President Trump's executive order on immigration. I think some of the reasons why, I don't go to your point. If there were an AUMF to use force against Syria, say there's an AUMF just says, you're authorized to use force against Syria, I think the courts would probably say that is also an authority to block movement of people between here and Syria. The thing that's funny about the Trump administration as executive order is that there are other statutes that already exist which would allow President Trump to do that and to do these other things he wants to do about cutting off movement of people from these now six countries in the Middle East. But I don't think he's figured it out yet. So there's another law that was passed in 1977. Well, don't tell him I said this. So there's another law that's passed in 1977 called the IEPA statute, which is the Emergency Economic Powers Act. And it allows the president to shut off all movement of everything between us and another, not just people, but money, goods, everything can be halted. This is the law that was actually used after the Iranian Revolution in 1979 to block off and sanction. You have to declare a national emergency with regard to that country to do that. But once you do that, you have way more power, actually, than the immigration laws would allow. And so I've actually been puzzled about why Trump and his administration hasn't explored these other things, but I'm very happy they haven't.
Number one, I want to say thank you for coming. And number two, as a card-carrying member of the Federalist Society, I just want to say it brought a tear to my eye when you said it's all about not deciding if ethically something is a good idea, but what the law actually is and where we can go. My question is also about the executive order. One of the arguments brought by the plaintiffs, as far as I can tell, is that the order behind it, while facially non-discriminatory, has some not good intent, and that therefore the order is not valid. And I have been going over it with some buddies, and for the life of us, we cannot figure out how. It seems as though, based on statements this guy made during his campaign, and since he's been president, that certain things he does have this irrebuttable presumption of being discriminatory. And so I'm wondering if it is that a reasonable argument to make if the effect is that it's an irrebuttable presumption that you can never, ever cure?
That's a hard question, but before we get to it, you got to get out more often, because you and your buddy should have more fun than going over Trump's executive orders. This is a real downer. So this is a really hard question, and to the extent the executive order issue is causing this conflict, this is the really new area of constitutional law that would be made or not by these cases. The rest of the cases about the executive order, if you've read them, you would know, are actually rather mundane arguments about delegation from the Congress to the president. They're really administrative law. But this one area you've identified is a new question of constitutional law. And the question is, if the president issues an executive order that facially, on its face, is fine, but you think behind it is a bad motive, are courts allowed to look behind the order to question the motive? So this has been done by the courts in rare circumstances, and it's usually done by the courts to the states. As far as I know, it's never been applied to the president before. On the other hand, the area where it has been applied most noticeably has been in the religion area. So the two cases. Because suppose you think President Trump issued this executive order limiting immigration from 7 countries. They happen to be Muslim countries, but the order doesn't say anything about that. It did initially with this exemption for Christian minority groups, but they got rid of that. So on its face, It just looks like, right, restrictions on movement from countries. But suppose you think he really did it because he doesn't want any Muslims to immigrate into the US. Although the order is very under-inclusive if that's the case, because the most populous Muslim nations are not on it. But anyway, what you would do is you would look at it and would say, is there really no other reason why this has been drawn this way other than for the unconstitutional reason? So there's two cases I'll just mention very quickly. One was about animal sacrifice in Florida. So a town wanted to suppress a Santeria religion, which involves animal sacrifice. And so basically the town passed a law saying, we prohibit killing any animals except to eat them. Right? And so the court essentially said, why would you pass a complete ban except for, right, this exception for eating animals, unless you were trying to get at religion? And struck it down. Then there was a second case involving a town in upstate New York where the local authorities drew the boundaries of a city to basically parallel, I believe, an Orthodox Jewish community to give it more political power. And again, the court said, why would you draw the boundaries in exactly this way that happened to be exactly overlap that community unless you were trying to give them this religious group power, which is unconstitutional? That's the only read, I think, that you could lay this claim that you're allowed to examine presidential motive on. The other complication is a lot of these statements are not by Trump himself as president. They're by Trump before he was president, and they're by people like Rudy Giuliani, who should never be allowed to speak in public again on behalf of President Trump. Although to get between Giuliani and a camera is to risk one's life. So Giuliani runs out, and he says, it's a Muslim ban. Trump said it's really a Muslim ban, and we just tried to figure out a way to do it without getting caught. Right? Giuliani basically says that. Can you use that kind of evidence to question the motive of the president? These are people who are not the president. Giuliani doesn't even work for the government, but he claims he had a conversation with the president. That is, right, that is completely new in constitutional law, to be able to use those doctrines about cities and states and apply them against the president. And then the question is, what kind of evidence counts or doesn't count as presidential motivation evidence, evidence of bias? That's what I think, if this case goes to the Supreme Court, that's the issue that the Supreme Court really will want to take. And if Trump and his lawyers are smart, if they lose at the lower courts, as they have been, they should change the order and drop it before it gets to the Supreme Court. Because if you were to lose on that issue, that will fundamentally change the treatment of the presidency by the courts. Imagine what would happen. Every decision of the president, courts are going to ask, well, what are you really trying to do? Are you really up to something naughty, or are you up to something nice? And what things are courts going to look at? I think the better answer is that we should, again, rely on Congress to fight with the president about this kind of order and expect the Congress to change the law or to block, right? They don't have to fund Trump's deportation force that he's talking about. They don't have to fund more immigration enforcement authority if they don't want to. I think that's the better answer than to look for the courts to save us, as we often do on lots of issues.
Hi, thanks for coming tonight. So I just had a clarification question for you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you talked about how our military has become more offensive than defensive, and you said that that was partially responsible for the 9/11 attacks?
No, I did not say that. I said on 9/11, we saw how offensively oriented the country was because we didn't have fighter groups in the U.S. that could capable of shooting down these hijacked planes. But I don't mean to infer that the 9/11 event is a cause of that posture.
Okay, thank you. So then my question would just be, on the day of 9/11, there was NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, was conducting operations on the west coast of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So do you not think that something like that would be a defense that's able to stop something like this from happening?
So we have a command, NORTHCOM, and then there was NORAD, that's in charge of, right, reconnaissance over North American airspace. Okay. So the question is, what assets do we have in the country to actually defend us against an attack that NORAD or NORTHCOM now detects? So with ballistic missiles, none, right? The primary function for many decades of NORAD and NORTHCOM's existence was to alert if there were a surprise missile attack. There's no defense to it. All we would do is use our own, right? This is the mutually assured destruction doctrine. But the thing that it really stuck with me after 9/11 was, if you remember, there was a fourth airliner that was headed towards Washington, D.C. and ended up crashing in Pennsylvania. And there were 2 fighter jets in the area that could intercept. And this is how I think my point is that we don't think about using our military to defend the continent. Is those planes did not have missiles on them. They were actually incapable of firing on the hijackers. And so, you could go read about this. I mean, this is public. The pilots were intending to crash into the hijacked airplane to bring it down. That, to me, is a sign that our military was not prepared for defense on 9/11. I mean, we have to rely on our pilots to crash our fighter planes into hijacked airliners. I think and I don't think we've spent a lot of money on defense of that nature since. I think we've spent a lot of money on, people call security theater in the airports, and the Department of Homeland Security. But I think if you were to look at the location of military assets worldwide for the United States, I bet we still have a very small percentage located in the continent.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. At the dinner this evening, you said that, and I'm paraphrasing, but everyone in the real world is either a utilitarian or a consequentialist because government decisions involve trade-offs.
That sounds like me, yes. I didn't know you were recording it in your little black book.
And so in that vein, the example you used was the fact that dropping nuclear bombs in World War II saved 8 million lives and thus was justified. So I'm a little more interested in the harder case. So if you, as president, had data suggesting that, for example, using sarin on 20,000 people would save 50,000 lives, would that be justified? And so I guess more broadly, the question is, do the means of attack ever matter, whether it's the use of chemical weapons, drones, or torture?
So first, I agree with the statement that I think people in the real world are consequentialists, and you have to be. I think government officials have to make decisions which involve terrible trade-offs. I think you and me in the university world, we have the luxury of not being consequentialists. We can always try to figure out with the length of time and resources and patience, we can figure out the right answer to everything. But I think in the government, under the pressure of circumstance, limited information, and the pressure, you have to make a decision on the spot, and it would probably be imperfect. So I think wartime, unfortunately, is filled with decisions about trade-offs. If you think about war, you are asking young men and women to go into situations where a certain number of them will die. Right? When we're not, in Iraq or Afghanistan, or, our commanders are not sending troops into operations where they expect 0 casualties. People will die. You think there's a greater good that comes of it. Right? And I think that is inherent in every decision in war. I think it's unfortunate we have to fight wars, but that is the nature of it. And so the reason I use the nuclear weapon example on you, which you will not let go of, even though we had a very pleasant dinner, is if you were a non-consequentialist, right? If you weren't utilitarian, then you should reject the nuclear weapons right away, right? Because they're such a they are the worst weapon, right? They are indiscriminate. They don't just, if you think about weapons, the nuclear weapons are so potentially immoral for someone who's not a consequentialist because they do not distinguish between civilians and combatants. They destroy everything in a geographic area. It's very hard to ever use them in a way that doesn't hurt civilians. And then their long-lasting nature means that the place you use them is uninhabitable for decades. So if you were a non-consequentialist, you should just say, no, I should never use a nuclear weapon. But I think at the end of World War II, I think Truman made the right decision. It is a terrible choice, but he thought it was better to kill 800,000 Japanese, most of whom were civilians at the end of World War II, 2 nuclear weapons, to save the lives of 9 million people who it was estimated at the time would be killed by an invasion. 1 million Americans, 8 million Japanese. So I think wartime is always like that. I don't think, again, law is not going to give me the answer to your hypothetical, should we use chemical weapons to save 30,000 people? I think part of what you would want to think about is, of course, you have a ban on chemical weapons, and we're actually using force now to try to stop people from using them. So a commander, the president ultimately would want to think, not only does it give you a short-term advantage, but what are the long-term effects? That's what a consequentialist or utilitarian would do anyway. But I don't think that we can run around and have war run by the John Rawlses of the world. I mean, if we did, we would just surrender right away and let them take all the stuff, right? And then, because we're redistributing it fairly. I just don't think that war can be run other in a consequence. So this is an example I always use. You didn't like this example over dinner, but I'm going to share it with everyone now. So we all love cars that don't pollute, right? We want gas mileages to go up, right? The government knows for every 1 mile per gallon increase in the mileage requirements, a certain number of more people will die in highway accidents because the way you reach the targets is you make cars lighter. And when cars get lighter, they cause more deaths when they come into collisions. Right? Are you going to say the government shall not make a choice about mileage per gallon requirements, knowing that you're going to have 3,000 more people or 1,000 more people die on the highway because of it? I'm not trying to be unfair. I just think every government decision has that to it. If there are any government decisions where everybody wins and nobody loses, we should have made those decisions years ago. Every decision you're going to come up with now is a trade-off. Take free trade. We know that free trade, the nation as a whole is better off. Some parts of the country are worse off and some parts of the country are better off. Would you say we can't enter free trade agreements because someone's worse off? I hate to say that's just been my experience in government. You have to be a consequentialist when you make these decisions. Aristotle and Plato are not going to help you very much, despite what they teach you here at Claremont McKenna College. I couldn't think of a better way to end than to say Aristotle and Plato are not going to help you much when you serve in the Defense Department.
That is all the time we have left for questions.